with this information. Obviously, our society is getting crazier and crazier. In fact, one of the points I'm going to raise for our guest coming up is this Wired magazine cover story, "Your next car will drive itself." Everything is going to basically this panopticon, centralized, computerized system to track and traces. Well, that makes it even more likely that when an EMP hits the planet or a solar flare or other problem, that our civilization will be that much more easy to knock off balance or destabilize or even plunge into a large depressionary crisis. And so I want to go to our guest here and talk a little bit about why he wrote Technology Fails, When Technology Fails, and also some of the points we didn't get to 2 weeks ago when he was on the show with us, from his book, When Disaster Strikes. And again, both books, When Disaster Strikes and When Technology Fails, are both available at Infowars.com. Because if you look at Katrina or if you look at any of these events, government can't and won't protect you. And then you look at what's going on in places like, and we're just doing some hookup here so we can get back on Skype for the TV viewers who are out there watching as well. So we'll finish up with that here in just a moment. But continuing, it's not even that big of a deal because we're on the radio, so everything's fine. All right, again, I'm on the road here, and we are joined by Matt Stein. And it is important to realize that as humans become more and more disconnected from reality, as humans become more and more disconnected from the land, as humans become more plugged into machines, take what's happening just with smartphones and text messaging. I saw big studies last year where young people have lost around a third of their vocabulary in just the last 5 years, and it's projected to even be lost more. People don't really talk. They sit there and text to each other 5 feet away. Look at how 30 years ago, before the Texas Instruments calculator came out, almost everyone knew basic arithmetic. Now no one seems to know it because it's not in use. Or handwriting, it's getting worse and worse. And with spell checkers, basic spelling is falling apart. And again, I'm not against technologies, but I'm talking about how they then adversely affect us when 90% of us live in cities and aren't self-sufficient. What happens if we have another Great Depression and instead of 7 million people dying from complications from malnutrition and illnesses over the 10-year depression, and we had close to 90% living on farms, and a lot of those self-sufficient. Now we have upwards of 90% living in cities, and those that do live on farms, only about half of them are self-sufficient, so that's around 5% of the population. These are the issues we need to discuss, and the social engineers admit they want us under Agenda 21 in these big compact cities under their control, and that's a major problem that we face as a society, is that the system wants us domesticated. Now, because he is a environmental scientist, because he is a design engineer from MIT, a really smart guy, because the info he covers I've checked out for myself and I find to be very accurate, certainly not fear-mongering, talking about real issues that we should prepare for. I want to ask him, before I get into some of the points that I know he wants to go over, I wanted to bring up to Matt Stein first. Obviously, modern environmentalism pushed by the big corporations and Ken Lay, who called for carbon taxes, and all of this is a counterfeit of real environmental concern of let's not dump toxic waste in the ocean, let's not splice all the major crops with animals and plants, let's not, have nuclear reactors leaking everywhere. All the real environmental stuff I see being ignored by corporate environmentalism, and I only see environmentalism being used as a power grab. And because you are a expert, real environmentalist from reading your books, and are into real sustainability, which is always individual. I mean, here's an example. They'll give you government subsidies to put in some solar panels, but they've got to be hooked into the main grid, which makes them basically worthless. And then they won't send inspectors out in most cities or most counties under environmental rules to inspect or approve your private solar panels. The system doesn't want real sustainability. They want a fake sustainability that's really a centralization. So I'm throwing you a curveball out of the gates here, Matt, and then we'll get into all the other big threats you say humanity faces and how you think we should deal with that, and some of the questions you sent over that you think are important for me to ask you that I agree are pretty powerful. But what do you say to that? Real environmentalism versus this corporatoid system?
Well, I'd say that the corporations are really running the show, and you can see that they're bitch and moan that some things like solar and wind can't stand on their own without government subsidies, and yet you get $10 paid in terms of tax subsidies and breaks to giant fossil fuel, oil, coal, nuclear companies get $10 subsidies for every single dollar that actually goes to sustainable industries like wind and solar. So it's like they're saying, oh, they can't stand on their own without subsidies, and yet they get $10 in subsidies for every one that goes to something else. So it's clear that the people who run on the show are the ones with the big money. And when you read about the environmental damage all over the world from the oil industry, and there are solutions to getting off of oil, but they take a long time. You can't just like flip a switch and it's instantly done. To implement these new technologies takes time and money. But the guys who are running the show are the guys who got rich and wealthy off the system the way it was and the way it's been. So they got a huge stake in keeping us going the way we've been going. Unfortunately, that's like heading for the cliff at 100 miles an hour or the end of the tracks and a big stone wall. And that's the way we're going right now. There's a lot of lip service to sustainability, but as far as actually changing any of the trends in our world that are headed for collapse, we're really not done a damn significant thing on any one of the 6 trends I identified headed towards collapse. None of them. So we give a lot of lip service, but we don't actually do much that's going to make a difference in the long run.
Expanding on that, I see the big corporations taking over the environmental movement as a power grab, not just so they can take over real estate, the name of the environment, but also so they can control the information and make sure no real environmental solutions ever get into the pike.
I'm not sure they're trying to prevent real environmental solutions. They're just after their own pocket. It's like they got rich and powerful through the way things were. So they have a stake in keeping it going the way it's been going. So I don't think that they're actively trying to collapse the world environmentally. I think that they just made their money doing things the way they were done, and they want to keep them going that same way, which is heading us environmentally for that cliff. So
okay, I haven't raised this point to you, but I'd like you to just read a laundry list of crises we face that you cover when disaster strikes, your extremely powerful book.
Right.
And then get back into any facets that you think are most important, but specifically on the front of GMO, nanotech, and things like that. Clearly, it's a proven threat that if there's a big solar flare, one of these massive events, it could knock out the grid for years. I mean, that's not denied. You've got the government reports that you cover in your book. But what about GMO? I mean, they're now releasing salmon into the ocean that they admit.
GMO is huge. I mean, if there was a drug that had the side effects that were shown in GMO, it would never be approved. And yet they're saying this is food that doesn't need to be labeled in America. So this is a classic example of corporate greed and people padding the pockets of both the Republicans and the Democrats. They're in bed with Bush. They're in bed with Obama. And it's a mega corporation, Monsanto, with GMO, and the data is there. In fact, Europeans looked at the data and said, no, we don't want your damn GMO. Keep it. It's like this stuff's dangerous. I mean, we would never approve a drug if it had these side effects. Why would we approve this as food? And why would we put it out as food and not even label it and let you make the choice yourself? So it's clearly corporate greed. And I mean, GMO is one of those things that, if you're going to say it's a conspiracy theory to reduce the population of the planet, I mean, it sure looks that way to me. I believe it's just corporate greed, but the evidence is so damning on GMO, you'd swear that it has to actually be an active scheme to kill off and sterilize much of the planet's population, make them unhealthy and make them sterile. So I mean, it's that bad. So that's something that is, is pretty mind-boggling. And if there's anything out there to let me believe in conspiracy theories, I would have to say GMO is so damning that it's just hard to believe there's not an actual conspiracy to screw up the health of the world and the reproductive systems of the world through GMO.
And then people that are into world population reduction, like Bill Gates, are the ones now owning much of Monsanto. And you learn his dad was involved setting it up at the beginning. And, the side effect of sterilizing all the rodents that they feed it to just so happens to be in all the major GMO crops. Undoubtedly, we've even found the documents where they planned all this, and it's just mind-blowing. Okay, let's start getting into some of the threats to humanity that we didn't cover in or any other facets that we didn't discuss, Matt, from those threats.
Okay, well, climate change is something, there's people who say it's not happening. I mean, most people are older. I call it global weirding, not necessarily global warming, because it's all over the map. But, there's complex systems of the planet, and humankind, with its 7 billion people, are definitely changing them. I mean, you cut trees down, it's a known fact. Each giant tree is like a water pump that pumps water moisture back into the air, and it falls as rain further downstream. And back in the 5,000 years ago, the Garden of Eden was the cradle of modern civilization, was called the Fertile Crescent. It's between the Tigris and Euphrates River, and it was like the Garden of Eden. And people grew up and multiplied and made babies and cut all the trees down and irrigated, and the land got salty and destroyed from the irrigation and cutting the trees down. It's now desert. It's Iraq.
Sahara.
Yeah, well, no, it's not the. Well, they did that in the Sahara too, but this is Iraq and Iran. That area was the Fertile Crescent. It was like Garden of Eden. Okay, so we cut down about almost a half of the world's, between a third and a half of the world's trees now, and most of that's in the last 30 years. So we're screwing things up. 90% of the large fish, commercial fish species in the ocean are 90% or more depleted, every single large commercial fish. So that means, and most of that's been in the last 30 years also. It's like last 30 years.
And I want to back you up. They admit that, but I used to go deep sea fishing just in college and would catch 10 times the fish. We'd catch our limit of everything. Now you can hardly catch anything most of the time in the Gulf of Mexico. And when I go to a restaurant, most fish I've eaten my whole life, they don't even have them anymore.
That's correct, and that's happening. People say, oh, now I'll admit population is a huge issue, and I'll admit that we have to proactively deal with it. Now, poisoning the world with GMO is not the right way to deal with it. I mean, if that is an active conspiracy to do it, I'm certainly not in favor of that. Now, I am in favor, like there's some wonderful programs, like Brazil is a perfect example, where they've gone, and you could say, well, lots of Brazil is third world, a lot of poor people, a lot of Catholics, and yet in 10 years, they've gone from like an out-of-control population growth to about sustainable, replacement level. And they've done that through a lot of soap opera type things where, basically they show these people with large families that can't support their families and their kids are sick and starving and all that, and people having a good life are actually keeping it under control. And so that's a good reason. I mean, not killing everybody. Just get this picture through your head. From the time Jesus walked the earth till Abraham Lincoln, that's 1,800 years, more people were added to our population in the last 10 years than from Jesus to Abraham Lincoln. And from the beginning of the new millennium till October of last year, that's just under 12 years, from 2000 to the end of 2011, we added more people to the world than lived on the entire planet 1,800 years ago when Abraham Lincoln was born. I mean, so it's, and we're killing the planet. We're soiling the nest. We're doing this to ourselves. Now, nature is not kind